very honored to Fritz Penn and the National Action Network for having me to moderate this conversation on the legalization of marijuana here in New York State. I am the founder of an organization called Educate, Don't Incarcerate. I'm also an adjunct lecturer and professor at New York University, where I teach forensic justice and problem-solving courts. A lot of my work surrounds the very conversations that we're going to be having here tonight. I want you to really be engaged in this conversation, to know the implications of what this means to our community from an economic and also, some like to say, a social justice and criminal perspective.
My name is Chef St. Michael. I am Communications Director for New York City NORML, as well as I'm a chef and educator on consumption. To tell you briefly, what we do with NORML is we partner up with some of the people that you see here at this panel and with other legislators from our community to educate them and to partner with a clear narrative on what cannabis should look like for New York City and for New York State.
Cannabis advisor and educator. I'm also the Vice President of Business Development for a pipe manufacturer based out of California. In addition to that, I've also launched New York State's first medical marijuana program for seniors called Golden Hands. My mission is just to educate the underserved communities to ensure that we do not miss the green rush.
My name is Delia Farquharson. I'm a city council member in Mount Vernon, New York, and I represent those in my community who have been adversely affected by the over-criminalization of marijuana. So those voices are absent because many are still incarcerated. Children have been separated from parents. Folks have been rendered homeless while marijuana was, since marijuana has been criminalized. So I'm here to represent the needs of a community that has not been heard.
Good evening. My name is Landon Dais. I'm of counsel at Forcelli Deacon Terrana, which I lead their employment and labor and cannabis division at the law firm. I'm the former political director for the Marijuana Policy Project of New York, which I helped with the PTSD bill and then lobbying on behalf of medical marijuana regulation expansion and the medical marijuana bill. After MPP, I was the political director for MedMen, which is one of the larger cannabis companies in the country, and then I was the national director of partnerships for MedMen, where I went around and did partnerships with organizations, politicians throughout the country. After MPP, I have two positions. The general counsel of Plush Green, which is a medical marijuana company in Missouri. We have 5 applications in their current application process. And I'm the chief strategy officer for Live Piff. We're only one of 7 black-owned multi-state cannabis companies. We have a cultivation license in Michigan and a hemp processing license here in New York.
And I'm here as a supporter of the legalization. I'm a current co-sponsor to the MRTA, which is the Marijuana Regulation Taxation Act, and trying to educate more about the need to do so, mainly because of the detriment that has been done to our communities, and to help create that path of prosperity through the new industry that we are trying to push this year.
Most people just call me JFK because they can't remember which one of my names is first and which one is last. But any will do. You can just call me James. I am running for U.S. Congress here in the 13th District of New York. That's everything above 96th Street, mostly. It gets a bit jagged at the end. My background is mostly in policy advocacy, specifically, cybersecurity and restorative justice. I relate everything to a data issue, and I am supportive of legalization here, not only in the state, but I think that we can use the rigorous process that's happening in the state legislature to talk about the exchange of marijuana across state boundaries. And not only what it does from an economic and business standpoint, but also the very real healthcare and criminal justice effects that it'll have. So I look forward to more questions. I have a whole lot to say about this particular issue and what we're owed from these changing policy times.
Well, one of the first things I think I want to just kind of do is kind of just introduce us and bring us in. I want to have Mrs. Stone. Can you please explain to our audience the health benefits that marijuana brings to our communities and what that looks like for you in the work that you do.
Well, first of all, marijuana is a alternative medicine that's natural. One of the biggest epidemic that New York faces currently is the opioid epidemic. So using marijuana as an alternative medicine will eliminate the opioid epidemic. One of the things that I've been able to discover on this journey is that most people are not aware of plant medicine, that everything started from the plants before we went into the traditional medicine that we use. So if we revert back to the beginning of time before we got into the modern civilization, then we have to understand what are the therapeutic effects of these different plants. So cannabis has many different therapeutic effects. It is composed of many different molecules. The two that we're most commonly known that we're all here about today is THC. Each of you know what that is. That is the one that gets you high, gives you the entourage effect. But the one that's sweeping the nation currently is CBD, cannabinoids. And what makes cannabinoids so different from the other molecules is because it has so many therapeutic effects. It helps with inflammation, it helps with Alzheimer's, it helps with chronic pain, it helps with sleep disorders, it helps with mood modulations. So there's a number of different afflictions that cannabis can resolve naturally.
Okay, so briefly, like I said before, I educate with cannabis, and we do it through food. Our purpose is like, microdosing isn't something that's very familiar in our community with anything. Like just moderation with anything. So with something that we all can relate to, whether we're stigmatized or not from it, is cannabis, and that's the segue that we're using. So we cook delicious food. We microdose the food with cannabis, whether it be CBD or THC. Regardless what molecule you're putting into your body, you should take it in moderation because it should be something that you have a relationship with. Because my relationship with cannabis is different from your relationship with cannabis.
A big issue that's going on when it comes to medical marijuana and dosage is because it's considered a Schedule I drug, there's a limit of research here in the United States. The leading country in research for marijuana currently is Israel. They are 10, 15 years ahead of the United States. But with that said, just to the chef's alcohol analogy, I can drink 5 glasses of gin and tonic and have no issue, but you give me 2 glasses of Hennessy and I act a fool. So each strain, each type of THC combination impacts people differently in the cannabis system.
I'm a non-smoker because I'm a control freak. And when I used to smoke like 20 years ago, or tried to at least, I would trip out. Now, I don't know what I was smoking and where it was from. It was just, brown and, I don't know. But the deal is, even as we pass it, and I have had some of these similar conversations, like you mentioned with Cuomo and other folks, and it is highly likely that sometime around the end of the next legislative session, that we will have legalized some form of usage beyond where we are currently in this state. But I think it still puts us in a relatively dangerous place because the way America makes decisions is as a federation of regulations to see who's doing what best. And we don't have nearly enough states in play right now. And if some of these trends take fashion outside of this state, they still put people that we are close to, people we are related to, in danger. And the real deal is, not only state by state, but at the federal level, there's not enough money in the pot, and we can't just look at what the Israelis do to do it over here. Number one, because it's a political issue. We'll feel like it's not us. And number two, it's just what they have is even, not enough data. We have to be able to invest in understanding what we're putting in our bodies and how those products get transacted between us, whether we're talking about on a community level, on a state level, or on a national level.
Because New York State has the most people incarcerated for marijuana, so it's critical, first and foremost, that New York State sets the benchmark when it comes to social equity. Now, one of the issues that I was able to identify and what we need to do collectively in the state at this point is to look at the existing states that have done it, but identify the gaps, okay? It's not about creating an exact model, it's about making the best model. So one of the things that I saw was the biggest challenge in California, because everyone was excited about the legalization of marijuana and social equity and giving some land and giving some money to individuals that have been incarcerated, right? Now, we all know that anytime the government provides you with anything, it's based upon measurements and outcomes, right? So now, what is the likelihood of an offender who just came home from jail, who's never ran a business, doesn't know anything about managing people in that aspect? What is the success rate of him having a legitimate company?
And how do we assist this population? Here in the city hall, and I think at some points in the state, there were these various ideas on how we can, assist this population.
Part of the reason why it was stalled this year was because we really wanted to get it right. There was the MRTA that listed out how the industry would be established, how amounts would be determined, who can grow what at home, what licenses you can get, separating the different licenses. So there's a lot of components to make sure that this legalization is as perfect as it can be and that it's fair to those that have been hurt by it most. So part of the holdup was also determining how much of the revenue that would be, made by all the marijuana sales, how would it come back to the state and back to our communities. So there was holdup at one point because they're like, oh, this will give us $1 billion. Yes, now we can pay for this. We can extend funding on this. But the idea got lost that no, this legalization is also a justice mission to make sure that those communities that were hurt were getting the benefit of it. So then the conversation switched, okay, 50% goes to our communities. How is it going to go to our communities? So that conversation then broke down into details about, okay, who's going to get the education on how to get a license, or if we're giving out loans, who we're giving out the loans to. Will the banks give out loans to help somebody start, a business in their neighborhood, in their town, and all that? So there was a whole, ripple effect of how much more law changes we have to do to make sure that the full legalization will be as prosperous as it can be.
Right. The overcriminalization of marijuana disproportionately impacted communities of color like the community that I represent. And there are still young men and women who are serving time for marijuana possession, right? And so how do we restore those people? How do we restore those families? Because when you think about it, in family court, parents lost access to their children because of marijuana use. People lost housing because of marijuana use. And so when we think about the issue of restitution, that has to be thoughtfully examined, because we must, a community like the one I live in has been decimated by the overcriminalization of marijuana.
This may upset some people in this room, because I've had this conversation with a bunch of faith leaders in the last week. I think we need to bring them all home. I mean, we can reconcile and restore them here, wherever they came from. I don't mean just home to Harlem, but whatever neighborhoods they come from. Right. That's number one. But number two, when you talk about restoring or reconciling with those families who have been, afflicted, harmed, I'm what you would call a universal basic income advocate, probably one of the world's foremost. And I think that we can set a basic income on proceeds from this new cannabis industry per those families, not just the individuals, because those individuals are just reflections of their family. I think that we can set a basic income that is specifically for them. Now, it won't solve the whole problem, but it will give them some breathing room, and that on top of these social programs that allow them to apply for pathways to either participate in the industry or go another way. Because, a lot of people who are in jail because of this industry, they didn't necessarily want to be. They probably want to go do something else with their lives. So
what I'm going to say is it's not going to be popular. Everything that has been said is absolutely right, and it's an inert emotional reaction.
Thank you.
And I understand that. But it's also about what can we logically get done and execute on. We always have tremendous ideas and we have tremendous things we will move through, but the problem that we always have is the execution points. So it's not that I want to lower our expectations or lower our goals, but I want to make sure we execute. And that has been the number one failure in our communities from a leadership standpoint, government standpoint, church, whatever you
Because we
want to
haven't
say.
been focused on the right issues.
So it's focused on the right issues, but it's also what can we get done? And what can we do? So let's talk about those who've been arrested. It gets a little complicated because as someone who's done public defense and as an attorney, yes, they might on their file say they're in jail for marijuana, but if you actually look at their case, they pleaded down to the lower charge, and that gun charge got thrown out.
You can still see both things in that
Yes and no,
Right.
because now you're making the assumption
No, you're
that
not. If it's filed, it's filed.
hold on. You are making the assumption that our criminal justice system is up to date on their data
We're
and
not
all
making any
files are up to date. Well, I'm just telling you, these are the complications
Sure.
that the criminal justice folks have been trying to deal with.
You're
I
actually
appreciate you
dealing
for adding
with.
And
color
this is
to
what
it. You're
the
right.
prosecutor's
Yeah.
saying. It's like this someone might be in jail for this.
Sure.
However, they also had a gun charge. So what do you do then?
Sure.
So that's one part that's complicated.
Sure.
You still have the federal part that is complicating the issue. The federal aspect is complicated the issue also.
Sure.
And it's still federal laws. The second or the last part, when it comes to those who have been pulled from homes, because that one is the one that I didn't realize until I got into the policy game, how many families were impacted. Calculating the damages on that, I think, is
Doable.
I
No,
don't know
it's definitely doable.
How do we calculate what did you do to a child when you took them from their parent and vice versa?
Well, you can never calculate the whole thing. It's just like the
calculate that.
conversation on reparations, right? The reason that they are valid and not invalid is because it's about reconciliation, not necessarily restoration. It's not necessarily restorative justice, but it is about reconciling with someone to say, I see that you've been harmed, and our effort.
That's not enough.
Huh?
That's not enough. That's,
No, I'm not saying it's enough.
Interjecting.
I'm not saying it's enough.
Because
I
I've
mean-
lived in Mount Vernon. I apologize because I've been waiting for a minute.
Let's really keep it in order.
I'm
I
not saying it's
think
enough.
this is
I'm
a
saying
very
it's
I'm
possible to
sorry.
calculate. I'm saying it's possible to calculate who's been affected. None of this will be perfect. But when you talk about like a dearth of leadership with regards to what we can get done, I think our problem, especially in our communities, whether we're talking about spots in New York or the rest of the country, is really that black and brown folks in particular have just been thinking about what they can get done in somebody else's system instead of offering the most ambitious, possibility, and then settling somewhere in the middle. And so talking about what we can get done versus trying to figure out how many families have been affected, which is basically a multiple of who's in jail, is not a real difficult thing. And will some people slip through the cracks? Sure. But would a whole lot more people be made generally whole if the leadership is willing to say, this is our effort, this is our peace offering, to say, can we move forward? And I think we're in a much different place. And that's a more social and spiritual thing
I
than
think
just
you're-
the
you're-
mechanics
I agree
of
with you on
policy.
that.
You're thinking that the tax revenue or the excise tax, which you can't make too high because then it just both alter the current illicit market, that pie is not as big as people think. Even though with Colorado just reaching the $1 billion mark, California has missed the mark on the expectations of tax revenue from marijuana by more than 36%. The pie has not been as big as people think.
This budget is not isolated. Not to interrupt, but yeah.
To create the amount of income, which I agree with, I emotionally attached to it, that we can create to make a difference for people. As someone who's in the industry, if you want to get in this industry, you need to be able to raise a minimum of $750,000 for a dispensary, $1.5 million for a cultivation site, $1.2 million for a manufacturing site. If you chop up how many grants that we would need to pull up, there's only you could be able to make is maybe 1,000 grants at that number that will mean something so someone can start a business.
You're a lawyer, right?
So even if you create 1,000 permits and you
Sure.
fund it, that's not going to meet the amount of people who've been incarcerated.
The cannabis pie is not isolated from other pots that exist, number one. Number two, you're an attorney, if I understand how you're talking about the firm you work for, et cetera, right? You're of counsel. No offense to attorneys everywhere. I think the fact that you all's training is risk aversion in general. I'm an engineer by trade. I don't think that the ability to problem solve in this issue about how we distribute funds to make our communities whole is something that we should ever leave in a lawyer or business person's hands alone. Again, no offense, but this is not about isolating the marijuana pie and saying, what if this pie is available to give people, a basic income or reparation based on this? And not that I'm saying those two things are exactly the same.
I agree with this brother right here and being analytical and staying away from the idea of just showing that it's a social injustice and that we've been pained from it and that we need to be reprieved for it. We have to have an analytical idea on where's this money going and why is it going there? What's it going to do? It's business. I mean, this country is a business. America's a business. That's why we have a president, and all companies have presidents. So I say that to say this, that when we speak to them, know what we're speaking about. We know about the social injustice. We know what it's done. If we think about it too much, we're going to be left behind. If we think about, well, Tommy's mom had to work double and da-da-da-da, yes, we understand that so many people got broken homes and their psyches are messed up from this. But what we have to do now is say, we have that true understanding. What are we doing tomorrow for the third generation, not even the generation right behind us, the 2 generations beyond that, because those are the ones that are searching and looking for the best examples. How are we standing? Like truly, how are we standing and creating that narrative with these powerful people?
You can be very, I hope that you can be very candid, and I think I asked a few of our panelists earlier, do you feel that the legislation and decriminalization, expungement of records, so on and so forth, do you think that this legislation goes far enough to assist those individuals and communities that have been impacted by the criminal justice system?
It goes a lot further than just incarceration. Like I said, it begins to impact the entire family structure. I don't believe there is any amount of money that can be given to pay that for it, first and foremost. But what I do believe we need to do is to stop managing the poverty and allow these people to succeed. Give them the right resources, eliminate some of the obstacles that have been set in front of them due to their criminal backgrounds. And we have to start with employment, first and foremost. Making them employable. How do we go about that? Now, even though you may expunge their records, but it does not do anything when it comes to the employer.
So in New York, they did bandbox in reference to marijuana. But was that just New York City? It was just New York City, right?
I thought it was New York State.
That was in New York State.
That legislation was
council.
Was it in New York State?
Not just city. So we have to think state because that wouldn't impact Mount Vernon. So the bill doesn't go far enough. So the one question that people keep, the key thing is revenue. One thing that was being negotiated last year, so in New York, there's currently 10 companies that have medical marijuana licenses. Out of the 10, only 6 of them are really operational, and the other 4 licenses have been sold over the last year or so. Part of the deal that they were working on was, in each state that goes from medical to adult use, anyone that had a medical marijuana license was grandfathered to the adult use license. There was a big fight on that because someone wanted to keep out those companies because they're big corporate. But what did come to realization was they could be used to help fund the social equity fund. So a negotiation was put out. There would be an auction, and then there was a settlement on a flat fee. And if they purchased the flat fee, which was going to be a 7-figure fee, that was going to go into this pool, and that pool would be used for social equity loans and social equity programming to help fund the MRTA. Because one issue that people started to realize, you can have part of the tax revenue go to social equity, but you're not going to have any tax revenue for at least a year or 2 years. So if you don't have a fund that people can pull from, those social equity applicants will be behind the 8 ball against some of the bigger companies because finance would be a big deal. So I do believe, and right now there's also a lot of constraints on the budget. So as much as some of the social advocates did not want to deal with some of the major corporations, that is a deal that I think is going to have to be struck because they're going to need at least a minimum 10 companies, I would say between $50 to $75 million to help kick off that fund, which then can, I think, give some real substantial financial assistance to companies to make sure they can participate in the adult use program, which most likely 2021 Q1.
California, as part of Proposition 64, actually slated one of their programs that would educate, finance, and uplift the men, those who have been impacted by the criminal justice system, to take an active role in the cannabis industry. And we know that, as you mentioned earlier, a lot of that did not relate to, educating them enough. Do you feel that we can learn from those mistakes in California and make that applicable to here in New York?
Identify where the tax dollars are actually going. We must define that. And right now, that's the biggest issue because nobody knows where the dollars are going. For example, good example right here in New York State. When you fill out the application, there's a $200,000 application fee, and then $10,000 is non-refundable. I've asked this question ever since I returned. Where does that $10,000 go?
So you have Axel Brenby at DOH. You used to have Jason Starr, who left, unfortunately. And Jason was the man. It was good to have a brother there. Basically, you had they didn't have this marijuana program, so you had people who focused on it. They had to pay salaries. When it comes to government, you have to fund the government entities that have to oversee alleged whatever market and business. So in the new MRTA bill, and I believe in the governor's bill, they would create this new offshoot of DOH, which would be over the hemp and cannabis bill. And a portion of the money from the tax revenue is going to go fund that department. So, because they're going to have inspectors, the people who are going to read your application, enforcement, all that stuff to make sure that you're following the regulatory guidelines that's going to be set in the bill.
Everything that happened in California either. After things were passed in California, they gave a lot of municipalities the option to opt out, and they did. And so it just opened up a floodgate of politicos, people that I know, who are going in trying to get ballot initiatives established, smaller municipality by municipality. So they just come into Mount Vernon because the majority of the people wanted to be legalized to push something through. But as a result, a lot of leadership and funding won't happen. Because the people who are elected, and we know that's a slightly different process than the ideological process of building up new industries that absolutely need to exist, they're not informed.
Local municipalities can vote out, and let's just be real. If you go to county, it depends. Counties, cities over 100,000, they're still negotiating that. But it's not just, if you go to California, there's no dispensaries in Compton, which is a historically black city. They opted out. And politically, as someone who was in the midst of that fight, you'd be surprised how many members of the Black Caucus were not supportive of legalization, specifically in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
No reason to go with names, but
in Harlem too, they don't like it.
Some folks don't like it. Harlem was on board.
But they took a while. Harlem on board. They took a while to come. Harlem was on board. I was just with a coalition of Baptist ministers Monday before last, trying to talk about this particular issue and figure out a common ground. Because it's coming no matter what. And I don't know if this is the business panel, if we're still on the decrim piece or where we're going, but my conversation with them was really about, and even as we talked about budgets earlier, coming specifically from cannabis, this is more of a real estate issue than anything else, because federal law still says where you can move an illicit material, per where churches exist and where schools exist. And that makes certain pockets of these hyper-dense neighborhoods, and Manhattan is way more dense than all these other boroughs, extremely valuable.
It really goes back to the communities that have been directly impacted. And again, I'm going to kind of reiterate, one of the greatest concerns that I've had is that once we begin to talk about economic access to an industry, once we begin to talk about educating the community, particularly with a $1 billion windfall, somehow the stipulations and, like they say, y'all know I used to run the streets now. They say the game changed. And when I began to look at a lot of the other prior to this, when you look at those individuals who are able to access and have access to the cannabis industry. When you look at the greater majority of those corporations in Oregon, it's as if they want to control that. We'll drop some crumbs over here in economic, stimulation and like those words they always use in the black community when it came to this. So that has always, and it's been the concern of our black communities, that every time, we'll do some thing over here or something over there, but those individuals who profit profit. We don't talk about profit in the industry because we never really brought in those conversations at the table to talk about how we can profit. Because the educating and the licensing and all these things are usually out of our economic means, or we're not invited in those spaces to have these conversations. Let me say it.
Because folks think they know marijuana. Oh, I've been selling on the street. It's like, bruh, it's on a whole nother level, down to the science and the genomes, and it really is a science now. So I've approached, so I went to an HBCU. So I've approached the HBCUs, again, conservative. Reverend Butts is my pastor. We went to the same college. And when I first spoke, I was like, y'all need to have a class on cannabis science. There's some random PWIs who are starting cannabis majors, and I've gone to, the only school that's really taken up is two. Fort Valley State, because they have a research license part of the Georgia bill, and FAMU got a grant to do social justice research on the impacts of legalization in Florida. But the HBCUs need to get around this, because I'm telling you right now, I have a cultivation license. Cultivation is science. The processing part is science. And when I'm putting out my resumes and hiring people, I need someone who has a background in botany, biology, orgochem, chemistry, because I need to make sure that you can distill my CBD and THC through CO2 processing, and make sure that I don't have certain contaminants within my samples. And we need to teach that. But the thing is that we can teach that skill too, because in the processing and manufacturing businesses, there's also one job that's one of the most important jobs. They literally have to go into the grow rooms, take out leaves, and put under the microscope to see if there's mites on the plants, because mites can kill your marijuana crop, or dry mildew can kill your marijuana crop. So those type of things we can start doing. Here, I think Medgar Evers would be a great school to start that at here in Brooklyn, which is the only HBCU technically in New York. So, but again, it goes to this brother statement. We have this old thought process in our community, and we need to evolve and find a central ground. The biggest argument I've had with the religious argument is like, out of all the things y'all argue against, this is the one thing made by God. Like, it's legitimately made the most natural, and it comes from Israel all the way up to Afghanistan. It's one of the oldest plants we know in the history of our books.
That's right.
It goes far back in China to the BC, talking about the cannabis plant. It's one of the oldest medicinal plants that we know about as a human race. And the only reason it was illegal is because the DuPont family put money behind it in 1937, because the hemp plant, which we need to talk about also, is one of the strongest natural fibers, and it was a threat to their industry. So all of that, everything that we've dealt with is all because some very rich people were like, nah, this is a threat. Right. And then they use racism on Mexicans, using marijuana, and then African Americans on the jazz artists, Reefer Madness, and all that from that one little interaction.
Just on a community level, we would be able to join that. We can either come in as caregivers, all right? You can come in as a legit patient as well. What I think the problem is our culture has been stigmatized by what has happened with DuPont and us being arrested. So now, how do you tell a community that it's legal? We want you to go and have it, So. But if we can join these programs, the caregiver program is something that every one of you guys can be a part of right now. With that, you can bring your medicine, bring your patient's medicine to them, at any time, and you can make a business out of it, believe it or not. And I think it's a good start also. So when it becomes legal, people won't look into the recreational as the only way to get into the business. There's so many different opportunities out there. Believe it or not, like you mentioned before, there's an emergency program that exists right now under the Department of Health. And that's all because of the opioid epidemic. And to find out that the numbers of overdose that exist in the white communities have actually went down because all these companies are getting sued and doctors are getting sued. But to know that the overdoses have actually increased in the black community kind of tell you something. So what I'm doing and what I'm focused on is working with something that already exists. The medical marijuana program has been around. And
if we can get involved with that, we'll by default educate our community, and we'll be involved on a whole nother level. All right, recreation is just going to be this free for all. Everybody's just going to go crazy, and if you're not connected, you're finished. All right, it's just a matter of time before you'll be out of business. I think this is a little bit different because you're not only helping the community by providing medicine, but you open up doors and you open up an opportunity for things that they may not even thought.
But what we need to be mindful of is that there are a plethora of opportunities, and we have to educate our people on higher levels. We don't want to educate our people and give them bartender jobs and trimmer jobs. We don't want that, okay? I would like to see the black people or the people in Harlem working as the testers, do the quality assurance. You have so many high-level roles in this industry that's what we need to focus on, is creating opportunities for these individuals to position them to have generational wealth. That's the key, because this is something that we can all have through this industry.
Also, you got groups like We Act, who's also over here. They do a lot of training for people with green thumbs and they just established a new union for people to start basically working in this industry and making themselves available to the new corporations that are looking to come into the state. But the other thing, and this doesn't exist yet, I think per your question, like how do they get the licenses? A department of sorts will exist, and anyone can feel free to fill in some of the blanks here. I wish Nathalia was still here to talk about what the state is structuring. But there'll be a way to apply to, and I'm hearing buzzing about more licenses being available than what's the current conversation is. But we won't know more about that until, I don't know, at least after February or March. But as that application process takes place, people will have access, and there will be, some ownership stake, opportunities, and then some other job opportunities. But, do a lot of these, new entrepreneurs and companies have the infrastructure to compete with some of these, California and Ohio folks? No. And so I think that goes back into, if resources are being brought in from outside to participate in the state, that further validates that there has to be blanket fee structure that exists on the productivity, on the profitability to pay, at that point, not only just people who have been affected by the war on drugs, but also people who are going to live around these changing times in general.
So we have to vet those organizations, and I will go for the ones that have been established, like the Normals, the Leos of the world, who understand where this information goes. So like I have a 10-week class curriculum. I have it. It's free. You can have it. I don't care. Anyone can have it. It's basic. It's 101, but does give a good idea. 2, if you are trying to be an owner in this business, you need to take a crash course in private equity right now, right here. Because if you don't understand angel fundraising, Series A, Series B, if you don't understand corporate structuring, if you don't understand 280E tax, you will not make it in this industry. If you don't know what 280E is, just put it this way. If you basically sell what touches the plant, you pay an effective 65% tax rate on it. So there's a possibility that you can make $1 million a profit a year and still owe money after paying taxes after you put that money through. That's why it's also a real estate game. You set up one LLC, that is your real estate. That's your real estate. You set up another LLC, that's your hemp, which is now federally legal. You set up a third LLC underneath your C corp, which is your marijuana. Then, if you want to do the real smart thing, you buy a public company for $25,000 in Canada, and you do a reverse takeover of your entities here in the United States, so you can go through the federal market in Canada. But that takes about $50,000 in legal fees to get everything that you need for your financial reporting. But that's what the smart businesses are doing, because if you look at the current financial state of the major marijuana companies, they are bleeding. MedMen lost over $200 million this year very quickly. A lot of the major marijuana companies are not making the money people thought. Now, who is making money is what Julian's getting to, is these secondary businesses, ancillary businesses. They're the ones making money, because they're doing the marketing. They are collaborating and getting marketing patient lists, which is gold to these medical. Because right now, the problem in New York, the medical marijuana list is so small, you can't make a profit in New York right now because it's so restrictive. So if someone has that list and creates this list and has true data, that person can make a ton of money. What's the name of the analytics, the green thumb, the light companies, the tray companies, WebJoint? They make the shakers. So if you make pre-roll joints,
there's a company that came out with a shaker. It's called the Faro, I think, which cuts the buds and cuts down their labor. Those are the people making a lot of money right now because the picks and axes are making money. Research licenses, that's something that people are sleeping on because you don't have the whole financial issues and regulatory issues. So it's difficult, but it's really going to be about money. So you need to really start about your network, understand where you can fundraise, understand how to fundraise. And you're going to have to go into networks and understand, because I'm telling you right now, I'm a lawyer, and I'm reading these contracts, and I had to go to my friends like, yo, I need you to read this because I'm confused. So it really is going to be something that we really need to educate in the social equity deals, in my last part, not to go on. There's social equity deals going on in California right now. It's going to be happening in Illinois right now. I'm in joint ventures negotiations. We got to make sure that those who are social justice applicants are being fairly treated. And it's very hard because if you're bringing no money to the table, if you're bringing nothing to the table, the person who has the money is going to say, without me, you got nothing. I can go somewhere else with my money. And that is where it gets really difficult because I've been in that position right now. Like, I'm currently negotiating, I need $1.5 million. And my man is like, listen, this is what I'm going to get. And I'm looking at that deal like, I feel like Ariel and Little Mermaid. I would never want to sign this. But it really is, that's what's really happening. So you have to really understand what you're getting into and understand that one bad deal might help you get to another good deal, or that one bad deal can bankrupt you for the next 20 years.
You remember the gold rush. The people that became wealthy in the gold rush weren't the guys that got the gold necessarily, right? They just got a rush out of it. The ones that became wealthy were the ones that were selling the boots, the
wood, the axes, the picks.
Exactly. So when you got all types of level of business that exist.
Recognize where we are at this time in time. You literally are walking in historical days right now.
Revolutionary.
We are the only ones who will ever experience the end of prohibition on cannabis that could actually do something about it. And it's important that you understand how we're right now, from a strategic standpoint, where we are at this time in time, we are not time appropriate in our preparedness for this industry. We are not. We're not. So those of us who are already doing it are probably going to have to be the ones that's going to do it for everybody else when this falls. Because let me break it down to you in terms of a calendar. Like in New Jersey, we are in what is called a lame duck session. That means that the people who in our legislature and state senate, those who got elected won, and those who didn't. So the new legislature doesn't come in until January. So there's people there who could just vote for anything because they're on their way out. They're anticipating legalizing cannabis in New Jersey for adult use in the next couple of weeks. That's what's going down. Now, let me give it to you in terms of numbers. In California, the Bureau of Cannabis Control oversees a total of over 7,000 licenses in the cannabis and hemp industry in California. 7,000. We only got 6. And when we fall for adult use, New Jersey literally leapfrogs everybody and goes straight to number 2 behind California. Why? Because we have a population of 9 million people, and because of y'all, we get 110 million visitors a year. That is what's about to go down. And so you could go into this thinking you want to be greedy and you can make all the money. It ain't going to be enough. Not in the next calendar year. Now listen, if this don't go down in that lame duck session in New Jersey, guess what? It's definitely going on the ballot in November. So we got somewhere between 2 weeks and 1 year to get ready. Like from a logistical standpoint, and that's beyond, like what I say, 2 weeks to a year. So equity, all that stuff, logistically, we are not prepared. And so, like I said, those of us who are already doing it are probably going to have to be the ones to do it for everybody else. Again, while we don't know, when you talk about equity and all that other stuff, we haven't even agreed upon what that is. Some of us are still saying reparations. What we really need to be saying is restitution, because cannabis could never, ever give what reparations are owed. So when you put cannabis and reparations in the same conversation, you devalue reparations. Cannabis can't afford, it can't do it. But restitution, yeah, I need to be made whole because you did something to me. You used this on me. And you know what I feel like restitution would look like? Restitution for us would look like stewardship of the industry. And that stewardship will have to come through education. So what mechanisms do we already have in place that don't scare white folks? HBCUs. So we need to start bringing that whole thing, again, remember what I told y'all, it's much easier to bring down the government than it is to actually run one. So this requires for all of us a particular type of micro and macro level thinking. And we, unlike any other time when we messed up with real estate, they redlined everything. We messed up with .com, ain't nobody own a computer. We keep messing up with the hair industry, we just giving our money away. This one was built on our backs in our lifetime.
Marvis Burns, work with actually Landon here on Live Piff. That's a company, we're one of the few multi-state cannabis companies. For me, it's when I think of the work we do, when I think of what it is that we're trying to talk about and accomplish tonight, it's important that we just let's take a step back and look out and look down as to where we are. Right, this space is the fastest growing. Like the CAGR for the cannabis space is like 37%. So year over year, we're growing 37%. Compared to the year prior. When you look at the tobacco industry and you say it's, it did $120 billion last year in sales, and cannabis globally did $10 billion. It speaks to where cannabis is going, right? It's projected globally to get to over $65 billion in sales in the next 5 years. So if we're on a path going from 10 billion to 65 billion, when you think of opportunities, there's one for everyone in this room actually to get involved. We said it. You had the California gold rush, you had the .com boom, and now this prohibition is going to be the next wave. Probably, one of not to be experienced for another generation, right? What else can come? So with that, I think for us, it was always about just finding, the right opportunities and where we can make a huge impact and find underserved markets.
It's much like what everybody's saying on the panel. It's like, don't reinvent the wheel. Stick to the script. If it's not for you, don't try to fly if you only know how to walk. So. In cannabis and in cooking and with the cool and everything, it's like you have the opportunity, but if you're not someone who's well-versed or have any sort of understanding when it comes to cannabis, then you shouldn't cook with cannabis, because then you can mess that up. You can get somebody sick. There's a certain level to this where you can make it toxic. And it's like, that's all by temperature. And if you not have an understanding, if you have a passion behind it, then you shouldn't be in it.